details now. It's the 6th Global Entrepreneurship Summit. Now, it has been organized annually every year, of course, since the year 2009, and it was made official during that historic speech in Cairo by Obama, at which point he elevated entrepreneurship to the fore of the U.S. engagement with the world. Now, the first one was held the following year in Washington, D.C., and every year since then in Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, in Malaysia, Morocco, and now the 6th one here in Kenya. So what is this about? Basically, it's just about entrepreneurs, business people, venture capitalists, foundations, and world business leaders as well to come in, network, take a look at what is there. Basically, this is where you want to find your angel investor, if you like. Now, how did it come to Kenya? Well, the discussion began last year at the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, and the aim of that was to highlight America's commitment to Africa in terms of security, democratic development, and its people. The theme of that Leaders Summit was investing in the next generation, and it was here that the President of the United States promised that the next summit would be held in sub-Saharan Africa. So the big question, of course, we ask ourselves is, why Kenya? So put together a couple of statistics here that should tell you why Kenya is the economic powerhouse and why this was the perfect location for this summit on entrepreneurship. First of all, of course, is that Kenya has been ranked as the 3rd fastest growing economy out of the top 20 economies, top 20 fastest growing economies, I should say. And this is from a survey, excuse that typo there, by Bloomberg Business. They talked to economists, and that is what they came up with. And it's important to note that Kenya and Nigeria are the only African countries on that list. Now, this may sound rosy, so let's put in a little bit of a rider here that all of these great optimistic statements are made, even though Kenya is still grappling with a high rate of unemployment, high levels of poverty. Remember, over 40% of Kenyans live below the poverty line. Now, another thing that would attract the GE Summit to the country is the advanced human capital, with an adult literacy at 87%, and that is the highest in the East African region. And it would probably be due to the fact that Kenya has the highest public expenditure in education at 17.7% across the Eastern African nations. We also have a strong private sector, buoyed by relatively friendly market policies. But this one here is an important one. Kenya being the Silicon Savannah. Of course, you have the Konza Techno City project that's expected to attract tech companies. All of these companies you see here, IBM, Intel, GE, Google, Microsoft, are present in Kenya and have their regional headquarters here. Another important thing to note again is the relative political stability of Kenya, and this is even though we have had the post-election violence of 2007-2008, and I might add the Likoni clashes, the Molo clashes. We have had some of politically instigated violence based on tribal lines, but if you compare that with the region, countries like Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda, Kenya is considered to be relatively stable politically, and that of course creates a great environment for foreign direct investment. Also, taking a look at some other statistics comparing Kenya and the region, our GDP accounts for 40% of the region's GDP, followed closely by Tanzania at 28%, Uganda at 21%, Rwanda at 8%, and Burundi at 3%. Here's another one. Kenya's economy being resilient. If you remember, after the 2007-2008 post-election violence, our economy was literally at 0%. Of course, a number of years later, we're now at around about 6%. Another big one is the reopening of Westgate Mall that proves to the world that we are indeed able to bounce back. Now, here's another thing that I think Obama and Uhuru Kenyatta, two presidents who are co-hosting this summit, have in common. Of course, President Obama talking about entrepreneurship and using that as a way to engage with the world. But you will remember President Uhuru Kenyatta has on several occasions talked about entrepreneurship as a way of getting out of employment. And if we can move to the next one, there is where we talk about these funds that have been set aside for young people, women, Uwezo Fund's Youth Enterprise Development Fund and the Women Enterprise Fund. You remember after the last general election, the 6 billion shillings that was meant for a runoff, the President promised to channel that into the Uwezo funds. This is a figure that you want to take a look at. 10 billion shillings has been allocated to these 3 funds over the last 5 years. Now, that is a huge amount of money. Of course, there's the issues of uptake and whether the youth and women have the skills to be able to take up these funds and utilize them and use them effectively. Now, all of these things paint a really rosy picture, right? Let's remember that we have challenges of unemployment, insecurity, lacking skill sets amongst the young people, and the big one, which is corruption. So, the question we will be asking today on Checkpoint is, how do we harness the best out of this summit? How are we negotiating these deals? And of course, how are we making sure that we get rid of, corruption? We'll talk about how, corruption is now in the cost of doing business. Yeah. But you can imagine this young person who doesn't even have capital to begin with can barely afford corruption.
To be corrupt. Yeah.
Absolutely. So our panel tonight, very interesting. We have Anzetse, who's a development economist and a columnist with the Business Daily. We also have Sam Gishuru, an entrepreneur and the founder of NILAB. And we have Professor Joseph Kea. He's a public policy analyst at Kipra. So we'll be taking a look at all of these questions, and your views as well are welcome. The hashtag we're using tonight is Checkpoint. 22155 is the SMS number as well.
All right, and that definitely kicks off our coverage of the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, beg your pardon, this week with that big discussion on Checkpoint. But we still are covering other issues around the Entrepreneurship Summit and that Obama visit.